the possession of, or dare I say, the property of men or the male gaze. And so this expectation that women should please or act in a certain way or submit to or give men certain things, especially when it comes to sex, is reinforced. It's reinforced in media. It's reinforced in a lot of our politics and policies that exist. It's reinforced also in our families and our religious structures often, right? That the purity in terms of sex exists for women, but there's a very different expectation and even punishments or ideas around what it means for a man or a boy to engage in sex. And so all of these things start to build our belief around what sex is and what role we play in that. And the
Welcome back to Coates in Conversation. I'm your host, Kendrick Coates. In today's conversation, I speak with Candida Crasto, who is a marriage and family therapist intern and is also the co-founder of the podcast called Sex Happens. I learned so many different things in this conversation today. We discuss what consent is, ongoing consent. We talk about sex in sports, and also we talk about the stigma surrounding STIs. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did, and be sure to like and subscribe. Candida Crasto, how are you doing today?
Good. Kendrick, it's nice to see you. Thanks for having me on your show.
Yeah, it's good to see you too. I know we connected once through the Minority Fellowship, which was in San Diego months ago. And then we had a short little conversation probably about 2 months ago, which probably could have been like a whole podcast episode.
Or several.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to this episode because I think these are topics that are sometimes not talked about in depth. And I remember back in school where we would have like sex health classes, and it had nothing to do with consent, which is, I mean, it was years ago. But also kind of conversations in high school and college around just sex. It was, we learned what we learned through movies or pornography or wherever, which, as we all know, that's fake. So it doesn't really resemble
limiting at the very worst. Yeah,
absolutely. So to get the conversation started, what are some lesser known factors that can complicate the ability to give or perceive consent, such as intoxication, power differentials, and cognitive disabilities?
That's a great question. And to answer that question, I feel compelled to kind of define consent first. Because consent is something where we always think yes or no means no. We hear these phrases that are sort of catchy when it comes to consent, but what really is it? And I'll start with kind of the basic, which is actually knowing what you want, being able to communicate or set that boundary, and then giving someone the permission to either do or receive something from you. And it gets a little bit more complicated than that, but I'll stop there for a second and ultimately look at consent as a way that we communicate explicit boundaries. So when it comes to sex or anything sexual or intimate, oftentimes what we're thinking about with consent is, can I do this to you? Can I do this with you? Or will you do this to me? Or will you do this with me? And those 4 questions are kind of the basic 4 questions that we fail to ask, but that we should be asking when it comes to consent. And so some of the factors you talk about complicating consent, for example, intoxication. The difficulty here is that any type of communication can be hindered by an altered state of consciousness. So whether that is some type of drug or alcohol, or even fatigue, or kind of a certain perspective or attitude about certain things, right? When we come in with a really strong belief about something, that's not an altered state of consciousness, but it's also not taking into account other people's perceptions and other people's needs and wants. And so we come in sometimes even just with a self-centered attitude that is more focused on what we're experiencing than what the other person's experiencing. So I know I've gone a little far there, but in terms of consent, it's really those four questions. What can I do to you? What can I do with you or for you? And then what would I like for you to do to me, or what would I like you to receive from me? And so starting a conversation with these basic questions is unfortunately not common enough.
I agree. And I like the fact that you said, what can you do to me? And I think that is something that, unfortunately, in our society as men, we sometimes have privilege in that space of when it comes to sex or intimacy. And I won't use a blanket statement, but generally speaking, sometimes men think that, well, we are in the same room together, we're kissing, we can escalate this thing. And it goes, and the other point you made is other people's definition or idea of what they believe or think of sex. Can you hit a little bit more on how that plays into some of the power differentials as well? Because I think a lot of times as younger kids, as far as me growing up in school, didn't necessarily see how much power differentials played into whether it be intercourse or just any type of intimacy with the opposite sex.
Yeah, absolutely. Power is huge, right? And power is rooted in our very identities and contexts. And so to be a man versus to be a woman, or a boy versus a girl, there's already a power dynamic in the way that our culture, our society, the way media represents different genders, and how that plays into the expectations of what sex is, which I think was one of the comments you made, right? And so, what is sex is it can be anything, right, that arouses or that creates sort of a sexual connection, contact, or stimulation with another person. So, that can be kissing, that can be touching, that can be also looking at someone in a certain way that arouses them with or without their consent. And so this is where it starts to get really tricky, because a lot of our media and culture objectifies women in a way that they either are seen as or expected to act as the possession of, or dare I say, the property of men or the male gaze. And so, this expectation that women should please or act in a certain way or submit to or give men certain things, especially when it comes to sex, is reinforced. It's reinforced in media, it's reinforced in a lot of our politics and policies that exist. It's reinforced also in our families and our religious structures often, right? That the purity in terms of sex exists for women, but there's a very different expectation and even punishments or ideas around what it means for a man or a boy to engage in sex. And so all of these things start to build our belief around what sex is and what role we play in that. And the power dynamic comes in a few different ways. So, one, if we look at our society, as a society where women are somewhat less than or submit to men, especially in sex. So there's this whole giving and receiving situation, right? And a lot of pornography displays the women in a way that they're either giving a blowjob or receiving a facial, right? And this is how a lot of pornography ends. And so there's kind of this initial play where there's a submission, where there's a power role of sorts from the man to the woman. And then there are various positions that they may engage in, but ultimately the woman submits to the man. And the man's erection or the man's ejaculation is his power or dominance over the woman. And so we see that so often. Obviously, in pornography, it's very explicit. But when we look at it in movies, right, there's this theme where the woman and the man fall in love, and then the woman has to give up, change, or sacrifice often a lot of what she might have seen as her self identity or her authenticity in order to be with the man. And this typically happens more often in romantic comedies, but there's layers of it in various shows. I will say now we have more media that represents more fair, equal, and different power balances than we've ever seen before. But if it's not in the media, then it's also at home, it's also in religion, it's also in politics. So when we start to think about that power piece, it plays into expectations. What should I be able to do? What should I be able to receive? And it almost, on some levels, borders this feeling of entitlement, right? And I know that your podcast often appeals to athletes, and take in that context as well, the pursuit, the competition, this feeling of winning. Well, what does it mean to win when we enter the sphere of relational interactions? And I'm not even talking about relationships, but even just dating, interactions, being friends with people of the opposite gender. So far, everything I've said has been really heterosexual in nature and sort of gendered as boy, girl, traditional. But a lot of this exists outside of that as well, where once we start to notice that there is a different power dynamic between any two people, we have to be a lot more conscious of how complex it is to understand and give consent, because it's no longer a yes or a no. It's a yes in a situation where there may be danger, whether that's emotional danger, psychological danger, or even, of course, physical danger of saying no. And so this is where consent really starts to get complex. So if you add intoxication or other external factors to that, we're taking something that's already complex because of inherent power dynamics and then throwing in additional obstacles to being really present and aware of what the other person is experiencing rather than what we're experiencing.
Whew, there's a lot there. There's a lot there. And the way you broke that down in just example of how all of these things play out was just, it was beautiful. I'm going to play devil's advocate here.
Sure.
And I'm in a heterosexual relationship, and I'm the female. But my husband, he is the primary breadwinner for our family. And there are expectations that I have to have sex with him every single night. What do I do?
I mean, this is a really complex one, right? So as a aspiring therapist, I do work with couples where you have these expected transactional patterns that have either arisen implicitly or explicitly throughout the relationship. And the nature of this pattern kind of boils down to a few things. If the husband in this partnership sees the partnership in a hierarchical role situation and reinforces the idea that as the husband, as the dominant partner, as the breadwinner, for example, that being the person to bring in more money, there has to be a transaction, there has to be a different contribution. This can, of course, be a very dangerous contribution because at some moments, if it's without consent, it can cause harm not only to the person who's not giving consent but doing what they're expected, but it can also cause harm to the relationship. And so at some level, there's a lot that needs to be examined in terms of what the overall goals and understanding between the two partners are for these implicit or explicit expectations. Oftentimes, when I see that scenario, it's not something that's been explicitly stated, but the implicit understanding of it has been reinforced with comments, with gestures, with jokes, with things that they'll say around friends or family members about how much sex they are or are not having. And we see that in media all the time, right? There's advertisements that advertise pain medication like ibuprofen or aspirin as a way to get more sex out of your partner. And the problem with this is that we are again ignoring the needs, the desires, the physical, mental, emotional, psychological boundaries of the person who's fundamentally saying no. To me, what's worse is that we ignore the opportunity, especially as therapists, to actually bring two people closer together in intimacy in a way that's more sharing and choice and vulnerability, if we maintain these contracts that are so explicitly stated. Because the reason we would maintain a contract like that is if we believed we wouldn't have sex otherwise. So go one step further. You're the husband, and if you expect sex because you're bringing in the money, what happens if you stop bringing in the money? Or what happens if your partner says no to sex? Do you feel like there is no other reason for your partner to have sex with you? And do you see sex as a reward rather than a shared experience? So there's a lot of things to kind of break down. It's not to say that some couples may not willingly enter into some type of an agreement where, of course, I appreciate my husband hypothetically so much for the work he does, for what he provides. It arouses me and turns me on in such a way that I can't wait to have sex with him when he comes home. Now, that's a different dynamic, but the outcome on the outside can look the same. And oftentimes, even in the couple, they're not as aware as that statement or that set of statements to describe what's happening in that way. And so, even for them, it can feel like, well, there's a transaction, but I'm okay with it for right now, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a good point as far as couples aren't always aware, or they're not aware of their behaviors, and that's something, as we're going through marriage and family therapy, to be aspiring therapists, we do have that systemic lens to understand what dynamics cause other things within the relationship to happen. And I was reading somewhere, I can't remember, and this isn't, I don't believe, rooted in research, but they mentioned there's in marriages or relationships, there's two things that people gatekeep. The men gatekeep the money and the women gatekeep the sex. Now, I don't know if that always happens, but in my experience working with couples, I have seen those play out where the male in heterosexual relationships is in control of the money, and the women oftentimes are in control of the money or the sex. The other thing that I wanted to mention for people out there who say, well, consent is just a simple yes or it's a simple no, what are other things that you think people should be aware of? Because I think there are a lot of nonverbals that go into consensual sex. So can you, in your experiences and things that you see in therapy and some of your expertise, can you provide some context on, what other things people should be looking for when it comes to consensual sex?
Yeah, for sure. I'm going to touch briefly on what you said about power and control. And you're absolutely right. Power and control is, I think, one of four big dynamics that people work through in romantic relationships. And whether it's sex or money or children or family, there are numerous ways to kind of take that seat of control. And when two people don't have the ability to feel safe in vulnerability and collaboration and cooperation, which is a rare space for most relationships to be in all the time, there's almost this default to what do I have control over and how do I pull that string or use that to make sure I get what else I want from the relationships. You're absolutely right. That exists. And sometimes it's money and sex, and sometimes it may be other things as well. Um, but you asked, so you kind of went on to what I call ongoing consent. And this is a term that I first learned about in the ongoing development of regulations around psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. And in psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, so I'm going to back up for a second. In psychotherapy, we have informed consents. And our informed consent talks you through the risks of therapy, the benefits of therapy, do no good, or excuse me, do no harm, and additionally do good, right? And then what you may experience, what you may feel. It also talks about payments and everything else. But we use informed consent to create an understanding and a safety between us and our clients, knowing that we sit in a position of more power with our clients. And this is really one of the most important pieces. The therapeutic relationship holds a lot of power for the therapist because we are sitting in a position where the person across from us is coming to us in a moment of vulnerability, in a moment of crisis, something where they are beyond their own coping skills and knowledge and experience to go through without the help of someone else. And so when we look at that very obvious need for informed consent, what we recognize is that as the dynamic changes, and more so in altered states of consciousness with psychedelics, for example, consent needs to be given at all steps, right? And so that consent changes because the relationship changes, because more information arises, because someone has a personal, physical, emotional experience that they didn't anticipate when they first consented. And this sort of ongoing consent is something we build into therapy that's being now built in and regulated within psychedelic assisted psychotherapy because the nature of an altered state of consciousness is difficult. So, how does that all relate to sex and the complication of consent? Well, it's the same thing. So, when we are really in tune with an experience that we are having or that we are engaging in with someone else, we actually don't know exactly what is going to happen or how we're going to feel about it. I mean, let's be honest. If we knew exactly what was going to happen and exactly what we'd feel, sex would be pretty boring. So there's almost this excitement, right? There's this excitement, there's this vulnerability, and at the beginning of a sexual experience, two people may very well consent to having sex. But as we identified earlier, what does that mean? What does that entail, both in action, duration, intensity? Sex is an infinite experience. How we share it with someone else or how someone else decides to share it with us will never exactly be the exact same every time. And so as we kind of get to these phases of kissing, touching, licking, etc., what our body experiences may be different than what our mind anticipated it would. And these are these really complicated moments where the person whose feelings about consent change should say something. But should is such a tricky word. So if they should, but they don't, why didn't they? Did they not feel safe? Did they feel like they'd get rejected? That everything would stop if they said, oh, no, I don't like that you're doing that, but I don't want to stop everything at the same time. So there's this feeling of awkwardness. It could be safety, it could be expectation. I don't like this. I'm aware I don't like this, but if I don't do this with this person, they'll be angry, they'll leave me, they'll tell all my friends, something, right? And it usually comes down to shame and humiliation, rejection, or danger, right? These are some of the big ones that come up often. And this feeling of rejection or humiliation is huge because that in itself is psychological safety. So even if it's not physical safety, I know you mentioned the word violence earlier, it still could be emotional safety, death of the ego, or a challenge to the ego, which is a really integrated part of who we are. So to challenge that part of who we are without our consent can be really damaging psychologically. So it's at these moments where what we anticipated changed. The status quo has changed. I'm no longer enjoying the experience. I need to say something. But if I don't feel safe, I might not. If I feel insecure, I might not. If I feel awkward, I might not. And that is the first breach of consent. But you're breaching your own consent as well. Now, the opposite of it, what you were asking is, are there nonverbal cues that maybe the other person in this situation could tune into to be saying something of the sort, hey, are you okay? Are you fully present? I noticed that you don't really seem into this. Yeah, absolutely, they could say that, but they have to be expanded outside of their self. And when we're talking about teenage athletes or teenagers in general, how many teenagers do you know that have the ability to really genuinely take into account what's going on around them? The reason isn't because they're selfish. The reason is because of what's going on inside them, right? And so it's not necessarily to blame them, but the maturity that comes with taking into account your partner's experience is difficult to develop and maintain in younger sexual relationships. And so at the ideal time when you can do that, there's lots of cues, right? There's the word enthusiasm keeps coming up. Enthusiastic consent, enthusiastic yes. And when we say enthusiasm, it's really generous, right? It's over the top. It's like, yes, I'd love to do that, rather than sure. And you can hear the difference, you can feel the difference. So what the other partner can be doing if they're conscious of this and they want to be a partner who respects consent is to first take things slow so that saying no or stop is easier. And the second thing is to notice when that enthusiasm is starting to fail. And this is the part that can be difficult, maybe more for males than females. I know there's a lot of talk about how many women fake orgasms, right?
Mm.
And can a man tell if a woman is faking an orgasm? Can a person tell if another person is faking an orgasm? I don't know, right? I don't know for sure. I do know that it's possible, and that the more you know your partner, the more likely you are to be able to tell. So if you're engaging in more casual sex or one night stands, it can be harder. You don't know this person. And so, how do you start to gauge that enthusiasm? If you're not sure, maybe stop and say, hey, how's this going for you? Do you like this? And this kind of gets into more of sexual communication. Do you like this? Can I touch you here? Can I kiss you here? Would you like it if I licked you here? And this is stuff that I think people feel awkward about. There's no reason to, but we do. And it's because we're also exposing what we like. So there's a vulnerability in asking for permission, because if we get rejected, we face the same risk, ego risk, psychological risk, as the other person for saying, actually, I don't want that. And that's where all of this gets complicated.
I'm glad you mentioned the rejection piece, because we'll tap on that towards the later end of this. But I want to go back to, you mentioned something. The other person may not always know what's going on for them in the act of sex or intimacy or whatever is going on. And it brought up this thing that sometimes cognitively we can know what's going on, and we know, like, hey, this feels good, or hey, this really isn't right, but our body gets in the way and stops us, and like, what is going on? So you have the freeze state, where it's just like, I don't know what to do, because this situation is very similar to another traumatic experience that I forgot. And I think that's another big piece as well. And I say this all the time to folks in therapy, especially folks who have gone through traumatic experiences. Some of the people know the thing is wrong, whether it be in a toxic relationship or trying to navigate relationship dynamics, but their body just won't allow them to get over the hump and actually say the thing. And so I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because I think so many people, and I will say, as younger folks, may not always be in tune of what's actually happening. They just know, like, oh my goodness, I can't say anything. I can't move. I can't do this, because sometimes the power differential plays into that. Sometimes it's just like, my body's telling me something that my brain hasn't even really comprehended, and I don't know how to work with that. And this is the very first time that I've ever felt that. And so, even the other piece you said is like being in tune with your partner, understanding your partner, but having the open communication of, do you like this? Do you not like that? How would you like to go about this? And the last piece I'll say is, sometimes people think, well, that's just going to break up the flow of everything. That feels weird. The weird thing is not being in tune with your partner so that you both can have a true experience versus, that was okay, but something was off. And just like not even communicating about it. And I'll go back to just like, as a younger person, those things weren't necessarily taught in sex ed. It was just kind of like, okay, here's a penis, here's a vagina. This is how you put a condom on. That's it. And you're like, wait a minute. How do we even approach having the conversation about like what I like or what she likes or what they like?
Yeah.
And I don't know if we can move on without talking about STDs or STIs, because I think that's a big thing. So, how does the stigma surrounding STDs impact individuals' mental health, and what strategies can therapists employ to reduce the stigma and promote positive sexual health outcomes?
Great question. And as you know, I love to talk about STIs. I you take everything we've just talked about. You take that trauma response, which you identified, the body's experiencing something, not sending the message to the brain. You take the awkwardness, the humiliation, the rejection, the insecurities, body insecurities, base insecurities. Have I been to second base, third base, etc.? What my friends are going to think about me. You take all of this, and now you multiply it by, I don't know, a million, because now you have a secret that shouldn't be a secret. But the reason it's a secret is because what did you learn about STIs when you had sex education? There's that movie Mean Girls. I think it's in Mean Girls where they're in health class and it's, you can see the teacher saying, you have sex, you get pregnant, and you die. You have sex, you get an STI, and you die. And there's kind of this humorous but very I can't think of the word, when satire, right? Like you use the extreme of this joke to prove a point about how our society thinks about STIs. Now, STIs, like any other infection, the flu, COVID, strep throat, whatever, most of them come and go. The only difference is that, yes, we typically contract them while having sex, something that's already taboo to talk about, that already has all sorts of stigmas and shame surrounding it, depending on who you are, more shame, more stigma. And then you look at access to the information or the healthcare, right? And typically when I talk about STIs, I ask people, do you know where you could go get tested right now? And a lot of people have no clue. And some states, some countries, way better than other states, other countries. But you add all of these stigmas plus access to health, and going and talking to a doctor about anything can be scary, let alone revealing that you've had sex and that you've possibly have an STI because something isn't going right. And you can tell when something isn't going right. So all of this now compounds the difficulty of communicating during sex, the difficulty of overcoming these uncomfortable reactions. And so what often happens is a combination of things. You can either isolate because you're so ashamed of yourself and you feel dirty, right? Dirty, impure, gross. We ask people, "Are you clean?" We don't ask
Mhm.
people, "Have you been tested for STIs?" And so, what does that imply? That if you have an STI, you're dirty. Now, there's only so much separation the brain can do when we hear certain words and we see certain reactions from people. It's impossible to create a shield that says, oh, they're talking about whether or not I have an STI. No, we feel the pain of being called dirty. We feel the shame of being called dirty. So we isolate. That's one. We lie. That's two, right?
Mhm.
We don't bring it up because they didn't bring it up. So we negotiate. We negotiate with ourselves, our own ethics. We lack integrity, we lack ethics, and we allow that to perpetuate, right? And then worst case, we sort of willingly know or put other people in a situation whereby they could contract an STI. And the main problem with STIs is that untreated, they cause problems, right? Treated, almost all STIs are completely manageable. And I'm talking even HIV and AIDS, even hepatitis C are manageable if you know about them and you're able to treat them and check in on them. So now we're not communicating. We don't know if we have it. We feel like we can't access healthcare or good information without judgment, without stigma. And now we don't tell our partner and we sort of say, well, maybe they won't get it or maybe it's gone. And so there's sort of this lack of ethics in how we then share ourselves with people. And without that information, we've now put them in more danger, right? Because if instead we said, hey, I'm recently gotten over a chlamydia infection. I think I'm clear. I finished my antibiotics, but just in case, we should use a condom, or perhaps we don't do sex today and we cuddle or do something else. And a week from now, right? And these conversations feel hard because, again, rejection, humiliation, insecurity. And where is the humiliation? I have to tell you that I feel dirty, that I did something that the world tells me I should feel bad about. I had unprotected sex outside of marriage. And that's the other thing, right? So a lot of religious structures will say you only have sex in a married couple where both people were virgins. And of course, in this perfect world, nobody has an STI because you can't possibly contract one from thin air. But the reality is, and I think I saw a statistic on this, I don't know, recently, it's like 75% of people report infidelity in their relationships. So now we've exposed again, and I know this podcast isn't about infidelity, but when we talk about risk factors for STIs, they're everywhere. And sometimes you can get them without fully having sex, whether it's oral herpes by drinking from a glass somebody drank from, or wrestling. Herpes
Mm.
moves around, it's a skin condition, right? So again, they're treatable, they're manageable. People overcome them all the time and have very normal lives, but we've stigmatized them because they're attached to sex. And sex is attached to gender and power and culture and society. And so, by virtue of that, there's a lot of stigma and discrimination around sexual health care. And getting the right sexual health care becomes difficult. And as you're aware, we live in a world where right now, most of our country, every state in our country is discussing reproductive rights. And reproductive rights are also connected to sex and also connected to the shame and stigma around sex, right? And how these consequences disproportionately affect men and women, right? And this power imbalance. So there's so much complexity around how shame and stigma around STIs, around sex is embedded and really just deeply ingrained into who we are and into our society, our policies, and everything else. And that spills over into healthcare and education, right? The lack of sex education is appalling. The lack of sex positive sexual health care is appalling. And so, again, if we have to get this health care, holy cow, we're going to feel bad about it. And it's going to affect our sexual behaviors. It's going to affect who we have sex with, when we have sex, sometimes for good reason, but sometimes out of shame. And that shame is something that affects everything. It affects our ability to show up confidently as human beings in our relationships, in our professions, in our friendships, right? In our communities. When we hold shame, for whatever reason we hold it, it's going to take away from us being our authentic selves.
There's even like shame of even uttering the word sex
Oh,
in
yeah.
many groups. It was so interesting. I spent time traveling around the world, and I was just so surprised at how other countries openly talked about sex. But here in the United States, that was like one thing you just didn't talk about. Even some families I've had experience where like even saying the quote unquote S word, like
Hmm.
you just don't even say it. It's like, hey, are you guys doing the thing? Are you hey, you doing that one thing? And like it's a natural thing that human beings do. And I think, one of the big issues is we don't openly discuss it. And so we keep a lot of these things in private. And so if somebody were to contract an STI or an STD, it's like, well, let me just, and I think you hit on it, let me just keep this to myself. And then you're just only that's problematic because it's just spreading and spreading and spreading. um, I like that we've hit on STIs because I think in the athletic space that is something that is sometimes common. I mean, at least in my experiences, I used to hear folks in high school talk about it, and even in college sports talk about it. But the other piece to that is, and I think you mentioned it earlier, just kind of like a competition. I've got to win this thing. If I'm going after this, I have to get to home plate. And so how does the hyper masculine culture often associated with male sports impact athletes' attitudes towards consent and sexual behaviors?
A lot of athletes are rewarded for going the extra mile. A lot of boys, a lot of men, teens are rewarded for confidence. Like, this goes back to how we raise children, and when we think about hyper masculine versus hyper feminine, right? What are the ways we're reinforcing kids' behaviors? And what will we make excuses for and justify as kids grow up, right? And so with girls, there's often this need to look pretty, to have manners, to sound sweet, to not talk too much, etc. For boys, there's these phrases like boys will be boys and rough and tumble and what they're made of. And so there's this societal belief and expectation that boys are messy, boys are bossy, right? When we think of the confidence. So we start to instill these just in our language. Linguistics plays a big role. What language we use when we raise them. And it's very subconscious. It's not something that people think of. So then how does this show up in athletics? How does this show up in the hyper masculine, this environment of something above all else, right? I think my favorite example, which by no means is the full truth and nothing but the truth, is when Tom Brady and Gisele Bundchen divorced, and the whole world thought it was only because he chose to play football, right? And so there's kind of this, and you look at a man who, in terms of a prize, and I'm being very stereotypical here, but to kind of prove a point, in terms of a prize, in terms of winning the woman that every man wants and probably has, every teen has a poster of her, in their college dorm or in their bedroom, right? He had this woman. He had this woman. Why? Because he was so good at sports. And I'm sure, of course, between them, there was a lot more substance. But on the outside, the star quarterback gets the hot girl, and the star quarterback gets the hot girl, and they have the perfect relationship on the outside. And of course, the perfect girl or the cheerleader or the model has to put out for the star quarterback, because the star quarterback is the winner, is the king, like, deserves this. So I think it kind of feeds in both directions, right? There's almost this, and I've heard this on both sides as a therapist who works with kids, right? This ranking, there's this hierarchy that's created, especially in adolescence, of who's better than me, who am I better than, and what does it get me to be better, cooler, more popular, more whatever than someone else. And sports is a way to prove your worth, and to prove your worth in a very quantitative fashion. And if you can prove your worth in a quantitative fashion, then your expectation is that you have your choice of all the women, or you have your choice of all the girls, right? And this narrative exists in so many movies. I mean, it's almost impossible to count, right? And not just movies, but songs and everything else. Like, right, there's this prize. And even in I mean, I hate to say it, but like in nature, right? You look at the male species and how they present themselves, and they really court the female. So I don't know how far this goes back and how evolutionary it is, but we use sports as a way to prove worth. And this comes from one of my favorite books. It's called Love Worth Making by Stephen Schneider, who's a certified sex therapist. And he says, men do and women be. And this attraction, this instinctual attraction for being pretty, for being something to look at. You be, and the man does, and that's his worth, and that's his value, and that's his attraction. So sports gives men the avenue to do, and to do well, and to do in a way that's public and that's seen, right? And so that doing instinctually makes, more than likely, makes this hyper masculine feel like, yes, I am man. I am worthy, right? Like, I should now be rewarded in this way. And similar to your example before of, I'm the breadwinner, look what I've done. And so it's not to necessarily separate that, because there are a lot of people who still very much value these traditional role structures. And there's no problem with these traditional role structures. What we started talking about is consent. And so, how do we bring consent into these hyper masculine or traditional role structures? And what I've started to see in younger generations is this evolution of a man of honor, a man of integrity, right? And even if we look at these archetypes, the king, the prince, the knight in shining armor, we see them as good people. And so, what does a good person do? Well, they don't disrespect, they don't demand sex, right? But we somehow lose the subtlety of a lot of these stories and fables and these historical archetypes, because in my opinion, and the way that I would like to see the divine or the hyper masculine or the sort of royal masculine archetype evolve, is that for sure you are doing, you are creating, and that is valuable and arousing, but that doesn't mean that you abuse that power. And it comes down to that power again, right? The abuse of power is the problem, not the power in itself. And for a woman to feel power, the man has to create that safety with his. And this comes from a very traditional structure, right? So I'm not saying that a woman can only get power in the space of a man who's creating that space for her. But if you are in a heterosexual relationship and that power dynamic does exist, the person with more power, whoever it is, man or woman, needs to acknowledge and create the safe space for the other person to feel empowered in their energy, masculine, feminine, etc., in order to show up fully and for that to be a collaborative, loving, healthy dynamic and relationship. And so that's kind of how I feel about hypermasculinity. In itself, there isn't a problem, but how we see it play out is often done in a lack of awareness, lack of maturity, lack of truly understanding what that means, what that power means, what that space means.
I think that you mentioned a good point as far as Tom Brady and Giselle. I've got the prize. I'm a man. I've got the prize now, and I would just use my own examples as far as just being a high school and collegiate athlete. And there was this. Well, if I'm a successful and a great athlete, that comes with the perks of, I get to date whoever I want to date because there's status. I've got
Mhm.
status now. But the thing, and I find this with many athletes that I've talked to in the past, the thing that happens is once that goes away, where is your worth? And I think you mentioned, how are we teaching our young kids? Because if the worth is in the actual sport, and we know injuries happen in sport, and so if there's an injury that just basically derails this long-term goal of whether playing collegiate sports or professional sports, where's your worth and who are you as a person? Because now you can't use the sport and say, hey, I've got this thing. I think this happens a lot in business too. We have this hyper focus on creating the next big social media platform or the next big bank or the next big whatever at all costs. Nobody's ever going to get in the way, and if they do, we're going to crush them. And I think it plays into this conversation that we're having as well, because I think these things are pervasive within sports sometimes, to where
Mhm.
I'm going to be the best athlete I can be. And then off of the court or the field, I'm going to take that same mindset of getting the prize or getting the goal, whether that be in a romantic relationship or casual hookup or whatever the case may be. And that can be very, very dangerous. And you see some of
Mhm.
those things play out on college campuses now. I mean, you have, in the past, you have athletes being accused of sexual assault or rape. You've got professional athletes being accused or actually convicted of those things as well. And we have to ask ourselves, was consent taken into consideration? And or was the switch that makes so many athletes great, was that switch, were they not able to turn that off in the
Right.
bedroom? And it was just like, no, I want this thing. And I think the other thing to highlight is it's so hard for the brain to logically be thinking when it is at that aroused state. And it's just like, everything else just doesn't even matter. It's just one thing that somebody needs, or I want, or whatever the case may be. Do you think these same things play out in women's sports, especially when we're talking about hyperfemininity?
Oh, as a former athlete and a former coach of high school women's sports, it's different and it's similar. I think there's very much the fawning of who am I going to date, and maybe if I'm in this sport, cross country, the ones where there's parity, swimming, where there's a men's team and a women's team. I've noticed it, right? I've noticed similar pursuits, but then I wouldn't necessarily categorize that as much in the athletic sphere as the other one. What I have what you everything you're saying for me brings up this fundamental question of who am I? And who am I if I get rejected? Who am I if I get injured? Who am I if this company fails? And with sex, it feels so much more dangerous to know the answer to that because our sexual selves are about 2 or 3 years old. And that's the stage of our human development where we develop the concept of shame. And so, developing the concept of shame, which is permanently interlocked with sex, and my goal as a therapist is never to tell someone you're not going to have any shame. We're going to get through all of it. No, it will always be there. And there is healthy shame and then there's toxic shame, right? But our shame develops at 2 or 3. And that shame is interwoven with sexuality, no matter what the differences are, right? And so ultimately, the who am I, we can justify away an injury. We can justify away a business failing. We can justify a lot of things. But when there's a rejection of us and our sexuality, our vulnerability, our creativity, our life force, when we look at the symbols that sex relates to, right? Creativity, life force, playfulness, childlikeness, all of this, it feels like a rejection of our core selves, even though it's not. And this is where I believe people who have the power of being a good athlete, being a successful business owner, because what you said about athletes and convictions on sexual assault and rape has also happened in the startup world, right? Where startup CEOs have many allegations of sexual harassment, sexual assault against female employees, and again, abuse of power. But where does it come in, right? Like you said, there's this belief that if I'm this good at something, not only do I deserve this, but people will see this and want me for this. They will validate this. So even if they say no, I can convince myself because I'm so good at this, I can convince myself that they don't really mean no. And this is the danger. This is the abuse of power. This is the delusional lack of self awareness and situational awareness that causes a lot of these problems, right? Because there's this constant rhetoric of, well, she liked it, she wanted it, she was asking for it, right? Either whether there was a behavior or a certain style of dress, or she was at a certain bar, or whatever it was. And the reality is, when we talk about ongoing consent, she could say, yes, let's go home together. And a half hour later say, actually, I don't want to keep doing this. And you got to respect that too, because that's ongoing consent. So I think it's so difficult in that state to receive a no because it undermines what your ego thinks of who you are. And if you can't recover from that, and that's years of therapy and a whole nother podcast series. But being able to recover from rejection, to recover from shame, that is one of the greatest skills we will learn in our life because the world is full of triggers for our shame, and especially our sexual shame. And so the goal is not to rid ourselves of shame because that's impossible. I feel that's impossible. But the goal is to recognize it, to sit with it and say, wow, that feels really uncomfortable. Holy cow, I feel like a loser right now. And wow, I mean, I feel unattractive and unlovable, and I'm just going to name all of it. And then I'm going to say, all right, how much longer do I have to be uncomfortable before I can start to remind myself that I'm still a whole, worthy person, regardless of this person telling me that they don't want to be with me or to have sex with me or engage in whatever it is, right? And that process of emotional regulation, tolerating discomfort, recognizing and lowering the reactivity of anxiety, that process of differentiation, the technical term, that is by far one of the greatest skills that I think we need to break down into education at all stages of life. Kids, adolescents, young adults, older adults, everyone, because that is our cycle. And we will constantly return to abusing power to avoid shame if we don't learn how to manage shame.
I'm so glad that you brought up the rejection, and that could be like a whole podcast, especially talking about male athletes dealing with rejection. But the emotional regulation, I think that is key right there, is learning how to understand when your system is dysregulated and actually what do you do once it's dysregulated. The last thing I want to hit on before we wrap things up is you mentioned ongoing consent. So it could be something to where two people meet at a bar, they go home, everything was fine and dandy at the beginning of the evening, and then it's like, I don't know about this. Ongoing consent doesn't mean, oh, she said or he said yes at the beginning of the night, and at 12 o'clock, they mean yes as well. Ongoing consent means minute by minute, second by second. Is this person enjoying the experience? Is this person enjoying the environment? And is this person safe and okay in our presence to continue what is currently going on? And I think a lot of times that ties back into emotional regulation, which I think from a societal standpoint, we are not often taught how to regulate our own emotions. And so this anger comes out because, well, I'm the man, I'm the quarterback, I'm the wide receiver, I'm the basketball player. I get anything that I want. You're going to give me this one thing. And people get in trouble for these things. And they're like, well,
Absolutely.
she said or he said yes at the beginning of the night, and they said they wanted it. So this podcast, there's so much in here that we could probably unpack for another 2 hours, but I just want to take the time to thank you for the in-depth and the education and expertise that you provided this conversation, because again, I think these are conversations that people want to have, but it's very, very uncomfortable talking about sex, talking about consent, and actually admitting like, I don't know what to do in this situation. But I also want to just give you your flowers and say that I'm so excited to have a colleague who's going into this space of mental health as a marriage and family therapist, because you are going to bring so many people the knowledge that they need, especially around sex, STIs, and consent, that our society absolutely needs. And I think that people will gain great value from having somebody that truly understands the ins and outs of that. So I just thank you for just taking the time to express these thoughts that you have, and share with the Coats and Conversation audience about what sex is and what consent actually is as well.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity. And as you know, I have to plug just once that if you want to hear more conversations about sex, you can tune into my podcast, which is hashtag Sex Happens. And I just want to thank you for having this podcast, for having the courage to have it as well. When I look at the audience that you have and I recognize all the different themes that people are experiencing, that male athletes, that young athletes are experiencing, you know, sex tends to complicate things, but it doesn't have to be that way. And if we can start to instill a sense of confidence and sense of self-awareness in young athletes, in young people, the way that that will ripple effect and change the way we talk about ourselves and about sex and the way we respect others will be tremendous just moving forward.
Absolutely. I agree. If you are listening to this podcast on Spotify or Apple, be sure to like and subscribe. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to leave a comment. What was your favorite part on this podcast? And if you know an athlete or somebody that just needs more information around sexual health or consent, be sure to share this podcast episode with them. Be sure, again, to like and subscribe to Coats in Conversation for more conversations after this one.